This is John Haller. I'm with my good friend Mark Sutherland. Today we're pleased to bring with us Trevor Loudon. Mark, why don't you introduce Trevor to the people that are listening today?
In many ways, Trevor doesn't need a lot of introduction because his work for a number of years by writing books like Enemies Within, Barack Obama, Enemies Within, etc., is astounding work. And Trevor is out there front and center in regard to showing where communism is, how it's affecting our world, and why we need to pay attention to it. And it's a real honor and a privilege to have Trevor's company. So Trevor, thank you so much for joining us. I hope I didn't murder the introduction, but actually showed you in the light that you deserve. So thank you.
No, I'm honored, and thanks very much, gentlemen. It's good to meet you both, and good to meet fellow patriots. So I'm happy to be here and happy to interact with the audience.
Okay. Trevor, what I'd like to start off with is you wrote the book Enemies Within, and maybe you could just, for people that might be listening today that are not familiar with you, to just kind of briefly describe what your thesis or points that you were making in that great book.
Yeah, well, I think the key point I make is that, we look at the West, we look at these strong countries like especially the United States and Britain, who are militarily strong, have reasonably strong economies, and people think that's the answer to world power. But what I postulate is this: for 100 years now, the communists, the Russian communists, the Chinese communists, Cubans, North Koreans, have been infiltrating our governments at the highest levels. Keir Starmer is a classic example of that in Britain. Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Kamala Harris are classic examples in the United States. And so we are not as strong as we think we are because we have so many of the enemy's people holding key positions in our own governments, in our own NGOs and legal bodies, etc. So we are the big reason we haven't defeated communism a long time ago is we got so many of their people in our legal system, in our government, covering for them, helping them, funding them. The fifth column is the big danger. The Soviets and the Chinese never could have taken America militarily. They probably could now, but they never once could have. So they had to get in on the inside. And, we talk about McCarthy back in the 50s and that kind of thing. I had an Australian friend who was an Australian Communist Party member who became a conservative. And I asked him about McCarthy back in the day. And he said, we were terrified of McCarthy, but he never went anywhere near far enough. And that's exactly right. The communist penetration of Britain, Canada, the United States, Germany, France, is massive. It goes right to the top of the system, and that's why we can't beat these people. That's why they are actually winning the war right now.
So the hang on a second here. I'm trying to find my setting to kind of make me appear back in here. So there was this theory, and so I'm 71, so I've lived through, the 60s and the 70s and Vietnam and all this. And there was this great sigh of relief in America that when the Soviet Union fell, we had won the fight against communism and we didn't really need to worry about anything any longer. And so I think everybody, kind of let our guard down, but what was your view of the fall of the Soviet Union, and was it a complete victory over the Soviets?
Look, the very, very best interpretation of it would be that we forced the Soviets into a strategic retreat, a temporary retreat. There are some like Anatoly Golitsyn, the Soviet defector, who wrote in a book in 1984, New Lies for Old, that this was a completely staged, managed affair, that it was a deception to get the West off guard that would enable massive infusions of funds into the Soviet bloc, which would allow the Soviets and the Chinese to rearm and eventually take us out. I personally subscribe to that view. And look, to back that up, but I urge people to read New Lies for Old by Natalie Golitsyn, classic book. But to back it up, also back in the 80s, I had a friend in New Zealand who was who had infiltrated the New Zealand Communist Party for our security services. He was a government spy inside the New Zealand Socialist Unity Party. In 1983, he was sent to Moscow to train at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning, the Lenin School, 3,500 students from all over the world, where they were taught racial agitation, how to end NATO, how to defeat the West, how we were going to defeat the West in a nuclear attack, all of this kind of stuff. And they were told in 1983, before anyone had heard of Gorbachev, that there was going to be a massive deception exercise. Communism would end. There would be a new liberal leader who would open up to the West. They would withdraw from Eastern Europe, but this was all a ruse. That eventually the Russians would rearm, they would work with the Chinese, and they would work on weakening the Western world, and then they would take the Western world out in a closed fist attack. So I've got this from two sources, Natalie Golitsyn's book, and also from my personal friend, John van der Ven was his name, who studied at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning and was taught this by Soviet instructors in October 1983. As I say, 2 years before Gorbachev came on the scene. He said this was supposed to happen under Andropov, the head of the KGB, who was briefly the leader of the Soviet Union, who was portrayed in the West as this jazz-loving, whiskey-drinking, new breed of Soviet leader. But Andropov died of kidney disease, so they had to put Chernenko, the old Soviet, Stalinist, in until they could train up Gorbachev for the role. So, yeah, I believe the collapse of communism was largely faked. In some ways, Ukraine, for instance, really broke free from the Russian grip. But if you look at our society, look at our universities today, they're all communist. If you look at our churches, they're heavily communist. If you look at our environmental groups, our open borders, right up until the last few weeks, all that's communism. So how did we defeat communism?
Well, that's a good question, Mark. Do you have anything that you'd like to ask?
Trevor, would it be fair to say that Lech Walesa and the Solidarity movement was all part of that ruse as well?
Look, Lech Walesa, yes, exactly. He was identified as a Soviet agent, but he led this great Solidarity Union movement in Poland, which sucked a lot of people in, because they wanted to see a rebellion against the communists. But yes, it was a ruse, and that's been confirmed. Really, people now know that Walesa had a KGB file or a Polish intelligence file on him. But this whole, look, the Soviet Union was way more powerful than Nazi Germany, but it collapsed with hardly a shot fired. Logic tells you that wouldn't really have happened unless there was some degree of planning and some degree of strategy behind it. And this has been confirmed by various defectors and various books that the so-called collapse of communism was an organized retreat with the objective of coming back later stronger.
So and so you mentioned, I think, that the alliance includes the environmentalists and others. Would you include some of these? I've sort of been looking at the Red-Green Alliance, and Greens and environmentalists, but also Greens in terms of Islamists.
Yeah.
Would you include them in this alliance, and how does that work? How does that manifest itself in the world?
Well, we call it the red-green axis. like right from the early days of the Soviet Union, they penetrated Islam, because when the Soviet Union was established, they ruthlessly persecuted the Christian churches. But they knew if they tried to do that with Islam, they would have had a major rebellion on their hands. They didn't have the power at that stage to keep Islam under control all through the Central Asian republics. So they basically penetrated the mosques and madrasas and came up with a Sovietized form of Islam. That was later transferred into the Palestine Liberation Organization, into Hamas, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, etc. What we call radical Islam is pretty much all directed by the Soviets. The leaders of Iran were almost all trained at the Patrice Lumumba School in Moscow. And this has been written extensively about. So even in America, you know, the Nation of Islam, the editors of its newspaper were Communist Party members. CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, the leading Hamas front in America, is run by Nihad Awad, who had a background in pro-Soviet communism. You know, Linda Sarsour as a Marxist. These people, these leaders of the radical Islamic movement in this country are mainly Marxists or manipulated by Marxists. And we see this in the recent protests against Israel on our streets. We have got Communist Party USA, Democratic Socialist America, Party for Socialism and Liberation, Workers' World Party, rioting on the streets all over America, working with Students for Justice in Palestine, CARE, the Palestinian Youth Movement, etc. The red-green axis is very real. You know, basically the Islamic movement is a battering ram used by the communists and the Russians today and the Chinese against Israel and against the United States.
So it's interesting, and maybe we can get into this earlier. There was a great, probably the most detailed report I've seen on October 7th attack, just released by Lord Roberts and a parliamentary commission within the UK, which was kind of strange to me because I would thought a report like that would have been coming out of Israel instead of the UK or a UK parliamentary committee. But one of the things they also found recently was that the Students for Justice in Palestine and other groups had long dormant Telegram channels that were literally reactivated minutes before the attacks began on October 7th, which seems to indicate that there was some kind of advance notice. But then I guess I'll get labeled a conspiracy theorist.
No, look, absolutely, that is correct. And you know, the leaders of Hamas were in Moscow 3 different times in the last year before the attack, including 4 days before the attack. There's also credible evidence to say that some of the troops, some of the invaders who came in on paragliders were trained in Africa by the Wagner group or in northwestern Russia near the Norwegian border, where the Russians have a paraglider school. So look, there's absolute, you know, you got to understand, Iran is a proxy for the Russians. Iran and Hamas are allies, and that's not supposed to happen because Iran are Shia Muslims who are supposed to hate the Sunni Muslims. But if you accept the thesis that these people are basically communists and the Shia and the Sunni is really just a front, they will happily work together. And there's huge evidence of Russian involvement in this, and huge evidence of links to all around the world to radical Islamic and communist groups in the United States and Western Europe. I think there's no doubt about that.
Real quickly, I mean, wasn't Khomeini, the leader of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, extensively trained in this leftist Marxist ideology in his exile in Paris?
Yeah, look, this guy was a Marxist. It was the Tudeh Party of Iran, which was the pro-Soviet Iranian Communist Party, organized that revolution. And they got Khomeini in power. He was one of theirs. All the radical Iranian students in the United States, they were all Marxists. They weren't Islamists. They were Marxists. They got their revolution, but the Soviets didn't want another communist power. They wanted an Islamic power that would work as their front. So once the Tudeh Party of Iran organized the revolution in collaboration with the Soviets, the Iranian, the Muslim leadership, the Shia, overthrew the Tudeh Party, massacred a whole bunch of them, and really moved it in an Islamic direction. But it's still a puppet of Russia. But it suits Russia a lot better to have an Islamic republic under their control than just another communist republic. You know, it's opening up a whole different front, and it rallies a whole different base of support. So that's exactly how it paid out, and still working like that in the Western world today.
Trevor,
Okay,
without
so-
this sounding, sorry, I was going to say just quickly, without this sounding a bit of a stupid question, but how much would have Zubrinsky, and also maybe keeping Carter out of the mix at that, how much of Zubrinsky was involved with that, and seeing Khomeini then leave Paris and go to Iran?
Well, I believe you're talking about Zbigniew Brzezinski, who always had a very strong Marxist background, by the way. He was Carter's Secretary of State, and Carter had a lot of Marxists in his administration. So I think Zbigniew Brzezinski, I think he played a major role in basically betraying the Shah and bringing the communist Islamic regime to power in Iran.
I suppose one of the reasons for saying that is to remind us of history. It's a bit like, you know, we look at the Protocols of Zion, Russian propaganda, and then jumping up, as you rightly pointed out recently again, in regard to Hamas, and then maybe the Russian links that were established from 1987, I believe. I'm not saying any of this to be clever. I'm just saying that the history and the involvement of this is really important to understand.
Yeah, look, you know, if you talk about Russian propaganda, you know, this is coming into the American conservative movement through QAnon, through the libertarian movement, through the alt-right movement, through some of the paleo-conservative movements. This is a real big push by the Russians to influence US conservatives. And one of the most obvious parts of this is the number of American conservatives who have now been J-pilled. Now, what that means is they finally understand it's the Jews behind everything. I have sensible American... See, you know, 30 years ago, after Reagan, you know, American conservative could define himself pretty well. You're anti-communist, you're pro-constitution, you're pro-Christian, you're pro-Israel, you're pro-strong defense, you're pro-small government. That was an American conservative. It was pretty, and the evangelical churches were a very big part of that. Well, now, because the Russians have pumped so much anti-Semitic propaganda into the American movement, you've got a whole lot of churches who are now turning against Israel. You've got a whole bunch of American conservatives who are now supporting the communist Palestinian cause against the Israeli cause. See, it goes back, you know, look at the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. That was a book that was promoted by the Tsarist secret police way back in the early part of the 20th century to basically justify pogroms and persecutions against Jewish citizens on Russian-held territory. That was picked up later by the Nazis. It was basically a book, a fake, that said the Jews are behind everything. The Jews want to control the world, and they're pitting the Goyim, the non-Jews, against each other to destroy them so they can take over. They're the source of all evil in the world. Okay, so then the Nazis used this, and they would go to the rich Germans and say, we're going to protect you from the Jewish communists. They go to the working class Germans and say, we're going to protect you from the Jewish bankers. And then when Israel was founded in 1948, and originally it was pretty oriented towards the Soviet Union, but they changed. And at that point, the Soviets became enemies of Israel ever since. And they started spreading this anti-Semitic propaganda all through the Middle East. Ion Pacheco, who is head of the Romanian KGB, who defected to the United States, wrote a whole chapter in his book how he was in charge of spreading the protocols of Zion all through the Middle East in the 70s and 80s to stir up hatred against Jews and Israel. But now this is being promoted through QAnon, through the libertarian movement, through the Ron Paul movement, and many others. This anti-Semitism is now being spread into the US conservative movement to basically turn conservative sympathies against Israel and to some degree against Ukraine as well. So there's a massive propaganda. This is why we see this massive increase in anti-Semitism, not just on the left, but also on the right. I can't tell you how many of my former friends have been J-pilled, and they'll send me all these screeds about the Khazarian mafia and how the Rothschilds are running everything, etc. This is pure Russian propaganda. The Russians have thousands of people pumping this stuff out every day on the internet, giving people all this secret knowledge, this esoteric knowledge, and it's fooled people like Candace Owens. It's influencing a lot of formerly smart people to turn their back on our greatest ally in the Middle East and basically support the communist cause.
Well, maybe now's a good time to pivot to what I consider to be, as a consumer of a lot of media and what I do, your interview with Rare Foundation last August. And by the way, I will just say, there was somebody I used to read. He's, I think, a libertarian. His name is Michael Rechtenwald. I'm sure you've heard of him.
Yes, I know Michael.
Trevor, I'm looking at his social media, and it is a constant, some of the most vile, anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist screeds I've ever seen in my life. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, like, what happened to this guy? How did he get, I think the term you used was J-pill.
Yes.
And I'm seeing this all over the place with Tucker Carlson, Thomas Massey in Congress, the Ron Paul types. So about 8 or 9 months ago in August, I think it was, you gave a great interview and wrote a paper or an article for the Rare Foundation. And I want you to just kind of summarize what you talked about that in that interview. And you also mentioned Alexander Dugin and his influence. And I remember it's probably been 10 years ago. I think it was in Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy. They wrote this giant article about Putin's brain. And that was my first introduction to Alexander Dugin. So summarize for us what you said in the Rare Foundation interview, and then we'll just kind of go from there and bring it into contemporary, today, American and European politics.
Well, what I talked about was the influence of Dugin and Russian propaganda on the US right to give people this esoteric knowledge. Like Michael Rechtenwald was a hardcore leftist professor in NYU, I think he was. Then he moved to our side of the street. And I've been at conferences with him, etc. He's a very nice guy. I like the guy. But I think he still had the residual anti-Israel feeling from his time on the left. And that's been amped up now. He stood as a libertarian, I believe, and the Libertarian Party is full of this stuff now. Libertarian Party is nothing like the libertarians of the 1980s, who used to be relatively sane and normal. Now they're full of leftists and anti-Semites and all sorts of people. But with Rare, I basically said that the target, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the dream of world communism did not collapse with it. After World War II, Nazism was taken down and Germany was denazified. Russia, when it so-called gave up communism, was never decommunized. you know, the Soloviki, the intelligence services, the KGB, the military hierarchy. They're still Leninists. They still believe in world domination. They still believe that the West is their enemy and must be destroyed, and they're working in partnership with China. So how do you know, they understood when the communism so-called collapsed that they still had the loyalty of the communist parties through Europe. You know, the Communist Party USA, the British Communist Party, the New Communist Party of Britain, the Communist Party of Britain, Great Britain, Marxist, Leninist, they're still loyal to Russia because they believe that communism is coming back. But who they had to neutralize was the Reagan coalition. They had to neutralize the people I talked about before, the people who loved Israel, loved Reagan, loved the Constitution, hated communism. They had to get into the American conservative movement and divide it and co-opt a lot of it for Russia. So what they did in the mid-90s, they started doing these conferences where they would invite American Christians and conservatives to Georgia and Hungary and places like that, all run by the Russians, and tell them what a great Christian Putin was, how he's going to stand with American conservatives against the radical gay agenda and against George Soros and against the radical Islamists. Even though Soros is almost certainly a Russian agent, even though it's the Russians who drive the Muslims, and even though it's the Russians who gave us the radical gay agenda. So the whole idea was to co-opt millions of American Christians into believing that Russia is now our friend, that Russia is standing for, you know, for Christian values, that Russia will go against the radical gay agenda and the Islamization of Europe, that Russia's a bastion of Christianity. And it's a 100% scam. But it was aimed as a massive propaganda exercise to neutralize and co-opt American conservatives and Christians. And there are many people in the Trump administration who have fallen into this trap, unfortunately. So, you know, like last Easter in Russia, 4% of people went to church. I guarantee it's more like 25 to 30% in America. But Russia's a Christian country, right? There is no freedom of religion in Russia. If you belong to the Orthodox Church, which is completely controlled by the KGB and is an agent of the Russian state, you can go to church. But if you're an evangelical, Seventh-day Adventist, Ukrainian Catholic, anything else, you cannot you can have a little church, but you cannot proselytize anybody, and you cannot even bring your children till they're 18. That's the reality. All of the evangelical churches who went to Russia in the early 90s to spread Christianity through this newly free nation, they've all had to pull out. They were all scammed by the Russians. They spent a lot of money there. The Russians took their money and kicked them out of the country. So, but you still have this large percentage of the GOP now, and people like Thomas Massey, and people like Rand Paul, and people like Tucker Carlson, and Tulsi Gabbard, and Jack Posobiec, and Steve Bannon, and Peter Thiel, who have all been sucked into this. And unfortunately, they have a lot of influence on President Trump. And so Trump is being led into a massive trap here by pulling support for Ukraine and trying to cuddle up to Russia. Cuddling up to Putin is like trying to cuddle up to Mussolini to take out Hitler. It's an absolute disaster in the making. And we're going to see this. It's going to destroy the Trump administration if he doesn't get rid of these people.
Trevor, can you, in your brilliant presentation at the Rare Foundation, you talked about the multipolar world.
Yeah.
You talked about that because Alexander Dukin was talking about that, and you were explaining that. Could you give a brief explanation of that as they were talking about, you know, the BRICS and the what we'd call the second world, even though we've all that has then evolved from the third world.
Okay, Alexander Dugin is been called Putin's brain, as you said, John. He's a philosopher in Russia. His daughter was assassinated a couple of years ago in a car bombing, but some people, Daria, some people might have heard of that. But anyway, he's an old KGB recruit from the 80s. He was involved in Satanism. He was involved in occultism in Russia. He started the National Bolshevik movement. He was an advisor to the Russian Communist Party. But he's Putin's brain. And he's written several books. And his basic theory is that we need to take down the West. And we need to create the stepping stone in taking down the West, destroying the West, is to create a multipolar world. Now, what does that mean? So this is a theory. It's a unipolar world. America is the number one top dog, unchallengeable. There is one pole of power in the world. But this is unjust and inherently unstable. So we need to start a second pole, the Russian Federation. We need to start a third pole, the Chinese Federation. So you really need to devolve the power away from America, more towards Russia and China and third world nations and Iran, etc. This is why Obama was so obsessed in empowering Iran, for instance. The goal is to take the power away from America and give it to these third world enemies. And you have got American conservatives buying into this. I've seen this at American conservative conferences talking about how great it will be when we have a multipolar world, that you've got a Russian pole, you've got a Chinese pole. The goal is very simple. You diminish the power of the United States, you increase the power of Russia and China, then Russia and China gang up against us and destroy us once and for all. That's the goal. But this, you've got to look, one of Dugin's main disciples or main echoes in America is a man called Curtis Yarvin. He's a philosopher. His grandparents were communists. He's been blogging away for a long time. He echoes Alexander Dugin's points. Dugin has praised him. And he is openly of the opinion that we should abandon Europe to the Russian sphere of influence and abandon Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Taiwan, Indonesia, Philippines to the Chinese sphere of influence, and America keeps the Western Hemisphere. Now, look, Peter Thiel, who's a big deal in the behind Trump, is a Yarvinist. J.D. Vance is a Yarvinist. Tucker Carlson has sympathies in that direction. There are many people in the Trump administration who have swallowed the theories of Yarvin, which is basically warmed up Duginism, which is why you see the very tepid support for NATO, why you see the undermining of Ukraine in favor of Russia. When Russia's on the verge of collapse and defeat, Trump's trying to give them a lifeline. While we see, so this is all Dugin. And Dugin openly called for fomenting civil war in the United States through using racial differences to bring down the United States. And Tucker Carlson goes to Moscow and interviews Dugin and portrays him like his grandfather, like his grandpa Walton or something. That he's just this friendly, old, nice, bearded Santa Claus type of guy. This guy is an absolute lunatic. He is the founder of the National Bolshevik Party. Many of our mass shooters in America were National Bolsheviks. The guy who shot up the supermarket in Buffalo was a National Bolshevik. The guy who shot up the Walmart in El Paso was a National Bolshevik, a follower of Dugin. Brenton Tarrant, the guy who killed 51 Muslims in New Zealand, my hometown, killed 51 Muslims, was a National Bolshevik, a fan of Russia and Communist China and following the theories of Alexander Dugin, as I believe was Anders Breivik, the Norwegian who murdered about 60 people at a socialist youth conference in Norway about 15 or 20 years ago. So, look, Dugin is very dangerous. He's completely backed by the Russian state. He has networks all over the world recruiting young people to his cause. So this is a scissor strategy. The Chinese are mainly running the left-wing communist parties. They run most of the communist movement around the world. The Russians, they run the right. They run the fascists, the alt-right, the Nazis. They're in the conservative movements. And so they are basically disarming us from the right, while the Chinese are empowering the communists from the left. And they were behind, for instance, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, Black Lives Matter. That's all Chinese. But the Russians are working the right. Marine Le Pen in France, the AfD in Germany, groups like this. And now, unfortunately, big sections of the Republican Party in the United States.
Wow.
So I guess the question is, well, dig into Dugan a little bit because, well, maybe the shift the context a little bit, look at or tell us a little bit about Russia, Ukraine, Russian Orthodox Church, and Christians in Ukraine, and I have Christian friends in Ukraine, and they will tell. I send them an interview that Tucker Carlson did of Putin, and they're livid. I mean, they are literally, they come unglued because of what Putin is saying, and the fact that Tucker Carlson seems to be completely in line with Putin.
Oh, 100%. You know, Tucker Carlson,
what's going on?
Tucker Carlson says, I'm rooting for Russia. Tucker Carlson has defended Alexander Dugin. Tucker Carlson is this complete shill for the Russians. And this is unfortunate because, you know, this guy's very popular. He's done a lot of good work. But when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, he is a complete and utter liar. He lies shamelessly, continuously. See, the war in Ukraine is this is the real background of it. You know, up until about 24, when the Soviets pulled out of Eastern Europe, they left a lot of people in power, particularly in Ukraine and in Poland. Now, the Poles got rid of the Russian element. The Russians weren't quite expecting that. Ukraine was still controlled by the Russians up till 2014, and the pro-Russian president, when the Ukrainians wanted to pivot towards Europe, he cancelled agreements to trade with Europe and wanted to go with Putin. That sparked the Maidan Revolution, which was a completely spontaneous, genuine revolution. The Russian propaganda, of course, says it's a CIA coup, and they play this very edited tape from what's the name, Victoria Nuland, to justify this. Yeah. But look, that was a completely spontaneous revolution against Russia. We should have applauded those people. They stood up to Russia and they kicked the Russians out of their country, and they wanted to come our way. So what does Putin do? He invades Crimea. Obama does nothing about that. And then he sends his little green men to foment a revolution in the Donetsk, because the Russian speakers in the Donetsk were being persecuted, right? You know, so that they had to have a revolution there to pull the people into Russia's orbit so they'd be protected. Exactly the same argument that Hitler used to take over the Sudetenland in Germany, part of Czechoslovakia before World War II, because the German speakers in Sudetenland were being persecuted. It was fiction then, it's fiction now. There was no persecution of Russian speakers in Donetsk. The Donetsk people wanted to remain with Ukraine, at least for no other reason by the fact that if you are part of Russia, your sons get drafted into the Russian army. Ukraine, you didn't. There's complete religious freedom in Ukraine. There's none in Russia. But there's been this massive propaganda operation by the Russians. Zelensky's a Nazi, but he's Jewish. Ukraine is full of Nazis. There are way more Nazis in Russia than there ever were in Ukraine, by the way. Putin, you know, Dugin is effectively a Nazi. Nazis are fighting in the Ukraine against Ukraine. You know, Ukraine is hopelessly corrupt. Well, Ukraine has its corruption problems. It's the US is ranked 28th in the world scale of corruption. Ukraine is about 101st, and Russia's 154th. So yes, there's corruption in Ukraine, but it's largely been rooted out, and most of that happened when the Russians were in control. That's when all the the Biden stuff was happening when the Russians were still in control. Blaming Ukraine for Hunter Biden and all that is like blaming Trump for Obama's economy. You know, it's a completely different regime. You know, Zelensky is very popular in Ukraine. He's still, he would win elections. But, you know, Tucker Carlson gets on TV and says things like, the Ukrainians are losing 7-1. 7-1 troops to the Russians. The opposite is the case. He talks about Ukraine is persecuting political parties. No, Ukraine shut down the Ukrainian Communist Party, which was loyal to Russia. Tucker never mentions which political parties were shut down. We think it's normal. No, it was Ukrainian communist parties that were shut down. Ukraine is persecuting churches and Christians in Ukraine. No, one or two branches of the Russian Orthodox Church, which were openly working for Russia, were kicked out of Ukrainian government buildings. That's the extent of the persecution. You know, you got to understand, the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine is an agency of the Russian state. And just as Britain shut down the British Union of Fascists in World War II, and America shut down the German-American bond, which is working for the Nazis, and that's what you do when your country's under war and war conditions. You shut down the fifth column inside your country. That's all Ukraine has done. But there's this massive, massive propaganda operation to portray Ukraine as corrupt and hopeless and persecuting people. And Russia's this bastion of Christianity that just wants to restore its borders. And here's another point that everybody seems to forget. Under Clinton, Ukraine was forced to give up the 800 to 1,200 nuclear weapons they had still on their soil from Soviet times. They had 8 to 12. They were the third largest nuclear power in the world. Clinton made them give them back to Russia on a vague promise of American protection from Russian aggression, and the Russians promised to never invade or attack Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. Do you think that war would be happening today if Ukraine still had its nuclear weapons? Do you think God is watching what America does with Ukraine? We forced Ukraine to give up their protection, and now we want to betray Ukraine, and Americans think there's going to be no consequences for that?
Trevor, sorry,
go ahead, Mark. No, go
Trevor,
ahead.
It's really interesting for me because I feel as though, of course, I'm sitting between America and I'm sitting between Europe, Trevor. What about when this whole thing comes out about, you know, in 1990, 89, 91, you know, NATO promises not to expand. That was all part of this discussion. And then NATO does expand. And of course, it's been said, Russia, Putin is concerned about NATO then being right on the Russian border. You could argue that that's one of the reasons why it went into Georgia in 2005, because they went on a preferential list. What are your thoughts on all of that?
Okay, you show me the document or the treaty or the promise that NATO would not expand east. You show me that. Jeffrey Sachs gets on TV and talks about this. There is no basis for that whatsoever. There was never any promise or treaty. Even Gorbachev acknowledged that. There was never any promise to expand, not to expand NATO eastward. Not one. It's a complete fiction. It's a lie. But it's been repeated so many times that people believe this stuff. All that was ever promised, James Baker gave an offhand remark that he would not expand, that if Germany was reunited, he would not put NATO troops in Eastern Germany. And that has been adhered to this day. There was never any promise whatsoever. And there never would have been an Eastern expansion of NATO had Russia not kept invading its neighbors. If Russia had stayed out of Georgia and the Caucasus, do you seriously think there would have been an expansion of NATO? It costs money to join NATO. You're making a target on your back for Russia. Why do you think Finland and Sweden Sweden, with 250 years of sovereignty, has decided to join NATO. They did this for fun because they know the Russians are building up to invade them. They know the Russians are in Belarus right now, getting ready to invade Lithuania and attack Poland. This war is, we haven't seen the heavy phase of it yet. The Russians have really really given up on Ukraine to a large degree. They're not even supplying their troops in Ukraine right now. They're putting all their resources into Belarus. And we may see in the next few months an attack on Poland and Belarus, which is going to catch the Western Alliance completely off guard and is going to make the Trump administration look absolutely terrible. And that's why I want to save the Trump presidency. I want Trump to do okay. But he's got to get rid of the people around him. He's got to get rid of Tulsi Gabbard, who's completely pro-Russian, his deputy director of national intelligence. He's got to get Tucker out of there. He's got to get Peter Thiel out of there. He's got to get any influence of Yavin out of there. He's got to get J.D. Vance out opening post offices and never commenting on foreign affairs. And he's got getting Elon Musk concentrating only on rooting out corruption and not interfering in foreign policy. If he does not do those things, his presidency is coming down, and this can be a tragedy for the whole world.
Well, that's a bit sobering. So I want to go back to Alexander Dugin. I'm going to pull up an article here. This was actually from a couple months, actually a month ago at Memory. Had done a interview with translated. Well, I think it was actually Dugin does a lot of stuff in English, and anywhere. This is just the title: Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin. You see his daughter there in the upper left-hand corner of that screenshot, who was killed in that car bombing. Islamic world's response to the Gaza war was pitiful and disgusting. It was a defeat, and we should not call it victory. Islam will become a real global power when it can destroy Israel. Yeah. So how does this not play into all of the things that you've just been saying? Or
look, see Dugin, he tailors his message for every audience. In Western Europe, he'll tell people, we're going to defend you from the Muslim hordes. In the Muslim world, he's talking about Islam being a major center of world power and how Russia will help them to destroy Israel. So, in America, it's more to the Natball people, we're going to create a white socialist republic stretching all the way from Vladivostok through Europe over to Canada. Different message, but Islam is very much part of the anti-Western movement, and Dugin is deeply involved in coordinating with Islamic leaders. The Russians are deeply involved with this. As I said, Hamas called Russia their best friend not long ago. Not Iran, not some other little Islamic republic. Russia is our best friend. And so Putin and Dugin are using the Islamic world as a battering ram against Israel and against the United States and against Western countries. Partially that's through immigration, partially that's through direct terrorist attacks, through political influence, all of it. This is all directed by the Russians, and Dugin plays a big role in this, and Putin's the puppet master. Well, the KGB, the Soloviki, the puppet master, I don't even know how much power Putin actually has. He serves at the pleasure of the KGB, in my opinion.
That's interesting. So I guess I have a ton of questions, and this is a bit, to say that this is a bit just disconcerting. And I've been watching this for years. I've seen this coming, and now that I'm constantly reminded of this. I'm a Bible prophecy guy, so I look at these things and I'm reminded of that quote in a Hemingway novel. It might be The Sun Also Rises, where one character says to the other, how did you go bankrupt? And he says, well, two ways. First,
Yeah.
gradually, then suddenly.
Then all at once. Then gradually, then all at once. Yeah.
And it seems to be why I don't think that Hemingway is up there with the writers of Scripture. It certainly seems to be an eminently wise thing. So I guess my question, and Mark, you can chime in too, because I don't want to dominate this thing, but where is this all going? I mean, so, now the right in America, the Prosobics, the Bannons, the Tucker Carlsons, the Candace Owens, we need to stop fighting foreign wars. And then, Candace constantly tweets out, Christ is king, and then this anti-Semitic rant that really puts to shame the anti-Semitism and the protocols of the elders of Zion.
Yeah.
Where is all of this going? I mean, what you're talking about, Russia invading, and Europe's talking about, now there's a fracture, it appears, between Russia and Europe, and I guess I'm just trying to figure out. You've watched this for years. Where do you think all of this is going in the next year or two?
Well, I think, look. Okay, when Ukraine was invaded, that was given the okay by China, and China was doing a mass mobilization at the time, and the Ukraine war was supposed to be 3 days, and then China would have attacked into the Pacific, and I don't think that is just Taiwan. That's going to be the west coast of the United States. I think Taiwan is really a diversion. And Iran would have attacked Israel. There would have been mass attack on Israel. Rocket Boy probably would have attacked South Korea and Japan. So I think we were on the verge of World War III. That's when we were supposed to have had World War III. And Biden was in office at the time. And really, Biden's been a Russia guy since the 1970s. So I think we would have been in the deepest trouble you have ever seen. And we've got to understand that America's nuclear arsenal has been massively degraded since 1992. We haven't built a new nuclear weapon since 1992. We don't even know if most of them will still work. And the Russians have been building up their nuclear arsenal, so have the Chinese. And their doctrine is to destroy the United States. So their two biggest enemies in the world are, of course, Israel and the United States. I think if Ukraine is allowed to fall, or if Trump pivots towards Russia, I think Russia betrays America and attacks into the Baltic nations. They use their power in America to try and get America to back off. You get a general war developing, and we're at a huge disadvantage. I think we're gearing up for the final push, the final communist push that's been the communists have been talking about since 1917. I think that is really the position we're in. Now, none of that takes God into account. And I think it was a miracle that Ukraine stood up like it did and held the Russians back. I think that saved us in the meantime. But now, and I think there's a war going on inside the Trump administration between the pro-Russia party and the sane people, the people who understand foreign policy and understand that America has to stand strong and needs our allies. We need Israel. Israel is not a charity case. We test our weapons in Israel. We test our Iron Dome material in Israel. They give us so much intelligence. It's unbelievable. They save American lives all the time. So I think we're coming to the point where, as Hemingway said, we have slowly been losing ground, and that could either accelerate, or given God's grace and some wise heads prevailing, we could actually turn things around quite dramatically. Look, Russia is on the verge of defeat in Ukraine. They are suffering. You wouldn't get that from listening to Mearsheimer or Colonel McGregor or Tucker Carlson, who just lie incessantly. But look, this is my view. All Trump has to do is reverse policy, stand strong with Ukraine, give them the weapons that Biden promised but never actually delivered, and clamp down on Russia with sanctions, oil, etc., and Russia would collapse. and you would have a new regime in Russia. Maybe Russia would divide into several countries. And people say, well, it could be worse. No, it couldn't be worse than Putin, because he intends to destroy us. Nothing could be worse than that. That would probably bring down the mullahs in Iran. That would almost certainly put huge pressure on the CCP, bring down the CCP in China, and Rocket Boy would get deposed. So I see, if we stand strong and with God's grace, we are on the verge of we could be on the verge of fulfilling Reagan's dream and ending the evil empire, or pushing it back for many, many years, or we could be on the verge of complete destruction. Either way, it's not going to be more of the same. We are going to get a fall really, really quickly, or we're going to come to our senses enough that we can head off this threat. But I think, this comes back to faith and courage. America's now pursuing a cowardly course. Let's just give Russia what it wants. Let's give China what it wants. We'll appease them and things will be good. When has that ever worked? When has it ever worked? This is a time for courage, for America to stand strong, because courage is proof of faith. People can say, I believe all they want. But unless they're actually willing to put something on the line, their life, their reputation, their fortune, it's just words. Courage in pursuing the right action is proof of faith. And that's where we get, that's our chance that God will help us. Because we need it right now, I'm telling you. Things are a lot worse than most of us realize. We could be in World War III in a few weeks, a few days actually, or we could get through this and we could go on to spreading freedom across the world for hundreds of years into the future. We could hand our children a hell on earth, or we could hand them a world that is defeated evil decisively and is moving forward into freedom and prosperity. We'll never have heaven on earth, but we can have hell on earth, right? But we can have a much better society than we have now, a much better world. Reagan pushed it hard, but Trump could finish the job that Reagan thought he'd done by bringing down the CCP, bringing down Putin, bringing down Rocket Boy, bringing down the mullahs, and it wouldn't be hard, and it wouldn't take much money, and it wouldn't even take a lot of guns. It's just cutting off our money to the Russians, sanctioning them, supporting Ukraine, who'll do our job for us, and cutting off the lifeline to the CCP. If we stop giving the CCP all our money and our pension funds, they would collapse pretty darn quickly. And you imagine a world with a free China, all of that energy, all of that entrepreneurship, all of that culture, all of that history, actually as part of the family of man, actually doing good in the world rather than being a parasite in the world. Think of how different things could be if we stand strong now.
Mark, I know you have some questions. I know you have some questions about the UK. Let me lead into it with this, Trevor. Back in must have been 2017 or 2018, it appeared to me that the Russian nuclear policy started to change. Putin talked at the Valdiv dialogues. And in that, he said, well, we wouldn't attack first, but if we were threatened, we will use our nukes, and you will go to hell, and we will go to paradise, I think was the terminology that he used. And now they've updated that nuclear policy to sort of put that into their guidance.
Their doctrine. Their doctrine.
Yeah, and so my question is, how real is this threat that Putin made and continues to make all the time? He and Lavrov and Medvedev and all their little lackeys and everything, and their TV media, they showed nuclear attacks on the UK and elsewhere. I mean, how serious do you view this threat that Putin makes?
I view it seriously. And look, if Putin tells you they would never attack first, that's telling you they will attack first if it's opportune. Putin said he would never invade Ukraine, right? When has he ever told the truth about anything? Look, there's two schools of thought. Some will tell you that the Russian nuclear arsenal has been massively degraded and that they haven't had the money for its upkeep. I think that's false. I think the Russian nuclear capability is pretty darn strong, maybe not as strong as they portray it, but strong enough to give us grave concerns. And we may be stronger. America might be a little stronger in nuclear power than we are led to believe. Maybe there have been secret programs operating. I hope there have been. But I think it's serious. See, this is the thing. Why hasn't Putin used nukes in Ukraine? Well, that wouldn't be a good look. This is his neighboring country. You're using nukes there. That's going to blow back on Russia. That's not going to be good for domestic, for his own people. So he's really at a problem with Ukraine. He's got to win Ukraine through diplomacy, disinformation, and military on the ground. So we've got him at a big disadvantage there because his military is getting rapidly degraded. He's lost over 800,000 troops. Can you believe that? We complain about Vietnam, 58,000. He's lost 800,000 in a population 2/3 the size of ours, or just over half the size of ours. That is huge. Lost tanks, ships. I believe they still have their nukes. They will use their nukes on Western Europe and particularly the United States. Some people are saying there are nuclear submarines off the coast of the United States now. Lee Wheelbarger, who's very much worth listening to, maintains that there are nukes off America nuclear submarines off America right now. I think it is very real, but I think the window of opportunity is this: defeat Putin in Ukraine, where he can't use them. That's our God-given opportunity. We must do that there, and then we may get through this. But if we put it this way. Defending Ukraine, backing Ukraine risks World War III. I believe not defending Ukraine guarantees World War III. Putin and Medvedev have already talked about establishing a pan-European home stretching all the way from Vladivostok to Lisbon. And others have talked about all the way to Dublin. So they're going to attack Europe. There's no question about that. If they take Ukraine, Europe's next. There's no question about this. The whole of the European Union has issued warnings to its citizenry right now: get ready for war. The Lithuanians expect invasion within months. The Swedes and the Finns are preparing their people for war. But most Americans are completely oblivious of that. If Tucker Carlson hasn't talked about it, they don't know about it. They're getting ready for a general war, and we cannot be fooled into thinking because they're doing so badly in Ukraine, that they don't have reserves elsewhere and they don't have nukes and they're not willing to use them, and biological weapons and God knows what else. So yes, I take it seriously. And if we don't stand up now, we're going to suffer. Like Zelensky tried to warn Trump when he met him in the White House. If you don't help us, you are going to feel it in America. He was trying to tell us what's coming, and Trump would have no bar of it. Oh, no, we're going to be fine. We're going to be just fine. No, we're not. How many, the communists are all through Latin America. We've got a communist president in Mexico. We've got the cartels there. We've got Hezbollah, Hamas, Russians and Chinese in Mexico. We've got a nuclear base, we believe, in Nicaragua, run by the Russians, that could reach America in a few minutes. We've got submarines patrolling off our coasts. We've got all sorts of things going on, and we think we're safe. Well, the only reason we're still not in World War III right now, I think, is because of the bravery and courage of the Ukrainian people. And what do? We spend half our time abusing them, half our time disrespecting them. The people who are standing between us and annihilation, who we should be back into the hill, are getting nothing but disrespect from a large chunk of the American conservative movement, and it's shameful beyond measure.
I'm just sort of gobsmacked by a bit. So, Mark, why don't you
well, I have to
some questions?
Thank you. I have to honestly say to you, Trevor, that it's very humbling to be on the end of your tutorial, and I'm not saying that to blow smoke in your direction, because it's there is a heck of a lot to think about that. From your perspective, how are you viewing the UK at the moment? I can tell you that I am not comfortable at all with what is going on with my own country, but I would be very, very interested to hear your perspective on what's going on here.
Well, it's very interesting with the UK under Keir Starmer. You know, Keir Starmer was a Trotskyist, but he also went to Czechoslovakia in 1987 and got himself a file with the Czech intelligence services. So they've been watching him for a long time. You know, so you've got in the British Labour Party, you basically, it's run by communists now. You know, Jeremy Corbyn was an obvious communist, probably a Czech agent. But Keir Starmer has been purging the left, but the faction of the left that opposes him. But then he's also been making, making noises about Ukraine and being on Ukraine's side. I do not trust him at all, unfortunately. He is also setting about a process of devolution. There's a communist program for Britain, and it's developing quite well, a devolution of power away from Parliament to the local councils and local governments, which sounds all right, but then all those local councils are controlled by the left. So he is trying to change Britain to make the left give the left permanent control over Britain.
Yeah.
And so he does not, I do not trust him in that he's really going to stand for Ukraine. Yeah, there's an element there that even these leftists don't want to commit suicide. They know what the Russians are about. And even though they are pretty much on the far left themselves, they might want to stand up at some point, but he's not someone who's going to save the country, that's for sure. And he is working actively on turning Britain into a socialist hellhole. There's no question about that. And the immigration is obviously a big part of that. People got to understand, you know, we've seen the massive immigration into Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Scandinavia, Holland. All of this was orchestrated by the communists. There was two constituencies for it. Just like the border invasion of the States, you've got the big businessmen who want cheap labor, and they've got the communists who want to transform your society and get more votes for the left. So that unholy alliance is what gave Britain the immigration problem it has. It gave Sweden the problem. It gave France and Germany. So the communists are hugely to blame for this. And then, so the communists change your country. They create a lot of crime, a lot of social discontent, a lot of division, and that encourages the fascist parties to basically rise up. And the fascist parties all work for the Russians, all work with the Russians, like the AfD in Germany. So, and Orban in Hungary. So, yeah, you know, so this is the thing, you know, we want good social policy. We want an end to the immigration. We want repatriation of as many of these people as we possibly can. We want sane education policies. We want sane defense policies. We want all of this. And the left are destroying the countries. Like I supported Trump in America because Kamala Harris, like my book behind me, Stealth, Kamala Harris's Communist Roots. Yeah. You know, because Kamala Harris is a pro-Chinese communist. So was Tim Walz. We couldn't have her. All she had to do was legalize 30 million illegal immigrants, give them citizenship and voting rights, and you would have had a permanent democratic government forever, a communist government run by the Chinese. So we had to support Trump. But I always knew that there were pro-Russian people around Trump. So that was going to be a problem. So now the battle has shifted to getting rid of those pro-Russian people around Trump. And that's your problem you've got. And with Le Pen in France, it's the problem you've got with the AfD in Germany, with Orban in Hungary. They have good social policies. They're doing the right things. They do popular stuff, but they're all pro-Russia. And that's the problem. That is the big problem.
Well, we've in the UK, you must be fully aware of the interesting row that's going on between Farage and Rupert Lowe. But the other thing is, you're also aware that within the UK in our last election last year, on the 4th of July, interestingly enough, 40%, 39.87% of people did not vote because they were so disaffected. And you have constantly talked about this in your work, which is this whole thing of the long game. And I'm not here to teach you how to suck it at all. We look back on the Fabian Society. We look on the people of the webs over here, and who then involvement in studying various things, going over to the Soviet Union, etc., and with various other people, saying, "Oh, isn't the Soviet Union wonderful?" and all the rest. That thread has always been in there. And Trevor, you're absolutely right. And it also, again, it's rather humbling and shocking in some ways for someone outside my country to confirm how I feel, how many, many other people feel in what's going on, where we see the fact that it is being destroyed. Now, Theresa May, a supposed conservative, in inverted commas, then signs the Global Migration Compact. Within the mainstream media, no one is discussing that. No one, Trevor, is discussing the fact that Keir Starmer was a member of the Trilateral Commission, which he stepped down from.
And a member of the Fabian Society, by the way, as a minister of his cabinet.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you have just described this whole thing of devolution, which, of course, Tony Blair started, and also, and then in bringing about the Supreme Court. Sorry, this isn't a history lesson for history lesson's sake. It's actually really, really disconcerting, and I will try to control being angry and how I feel with what's going on because of this utter implosion that I am seeing, and then trying to actually convey that to people and say why, which is why you have talked about the long game. We can go back to the Frankfurt School and all the rest. And I am not saying this to be clever. I am saying this because history is really, really important at this point in time, and understanding where we've come from and where we are going. In your opinion, then, and I believe, Starmer, of course, as you know, international lawyer, come from this point of view. How do we push back on this? How do we push back?
Well, I think we have to study history because, look, see, this is the thing. The left runs things. The left runs the agenda. How it works is, this is how the communists work. The Communist Party of Britain, the Communist Party USA, whatever, they control the labour unions. The labour unions control the Democratic Party and the British Labour Party, right? So the communists, by controlling the unions, control the direction of the Labour Party, the Canadian Liberal Party, the French Social Democratic Party, whatever. But then they also have people on the right. And you look at Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel was the one who let the million Muslims into Germany. A so-called conservative, Chancellor of Germany, so-called conservative. He let 1 million Muslim refugees in, just like Theresa May betrayed conservatives. And she was a leader of the East German communist youth. She was the ideological head of the East German communist youth, trained in Moscow. And then she becomes a conservative. And what does she do when she's a conservative? She adopts a few low tax policies and pro-business policies, but she orientates Germany towards Russia, and she lets 1 million refugees into the country. Exactly what you would do if you were a Russian agent. And so we got to be aware. This is how I see it. This isn't so much a battle between right and left. This is a battle between the common people who share values. We all believe in God, or would like to believe there are spiritual values in the universe. We all believe in family. We believe in individual sovereignty, national sovereignty, local control over local affairs. The French should run France, the Sri Lankans should run Sri Lanka, and the Brits should run Britain, and the Americans should run America. The people of Arkansas should run Arkansas, and the people of Arizona should run Arizona. That's what we believe in. What we've got to do is always push forward for local control, for the maximum amount of individual sovereignty, standing against the state. We've got to stand against the communists and socialists on the left, but we've also got to be very aware of the traitors on the right, the infiltrators on the right. And when you get a genuine reaction to the left, like reform, you've got to understand that people will get inside reform to try and corrupt things. People will get inside the Trump movement to try and corrupt things. That's the role of Tucker Carlson. That's the role of Tulsi Gabbard. That's the role of J.D. Vance, to co-opt the genuine populist pro-sovereignty movement and shift it into something much more dangerous. So it's discernment. People have got to try and get some sort of spiritual foundation in their lives. They've got to be able to study and work out what is true and what is false, and got to be very disciplined and commit themselves every day for fighting for what is right and preserving the world for their children and grandchildren. That's got to be our major driving force right now, because I think we're not going to get out of this without God's help. And that means a lot more godly people. That means people committed to truthful, universal values. I don't think the answer is so much political. I think the answer is spiritual. And that will filter through to the politics. We'll be able to see the lies more effectively. The better grounded we are as individuals, the more we can see through the lies. That is what I think is going to save us ultimately. Yes, work in the political, absolutely work for local control, absolutely promote good candidates, absolutely stand against vaccine mandates and other corruptions, absolutely stand against evil, be very resolute, but also stand for what is right. Because we live in a spiritual universe with spiritual causes, and the more we're connected to that, the more likely we are to make the right decisions and to get the help we need to go forward.
Wow, that's very powerful. I want to cover just a couple things with you before we finish here. I know we're kind of
look, I'm all right. Don't you worry. This is important, and people got to, I hope people will take ideas away from this. And if I'm up for challenges, I'm up for being proven wrong, all the time. But I'm happy to talk.
I'll be sure to send you all the hate mail we get.
Yes, please do. Please do.
But
I know
I go back and forth with very dear friends, and they're always citing to me somebody like, "Oh, did you see Douglas McGregor?" And my response to them has been, "Is this the time Douglas McGregor is going to be right?" Because he said 3 weeks, then 2 weeks, and then 6 months, and it's not happened. So I put up the cover of the new annual threat assessment from the U.S. intelligence community, and Tulsi Gabbard was at Senate or House hearings over the past couple of days testifying about that. And buried in there, of course, is the Russian nuclear threat. But then there is this page that's very dismissive of the Iranian nuclear threat. Like, well, Khomeini has not authorized has not authorized the building of a nuclear weapon yet. And it seems to be very much in line with what I can only term, even back to the Reagan days, this pro-Iranian revolution bias that permeates the American intelligence community and
Absolutely.
military community. And so I want you to comment on that and whether we're missing something there. And then if you have time and if you have an opinion, I would like to pivot to, I was told by a very good Bible teacher many years ago, you need to pay attention to Turkey, John. Watch Turkey. And so now I've seen Turkey very cleverly playing the long game in Syria, and now having used a radical Islamist to take over the government. And all of a sudden he's like, like somebody would appear on a cereal box in America. He's all dressed up and everything, and everybody's running to him. And kind of tell me the interplay, if you have an opinion, of like between Turkey, Russia, Syria, Israel, and how that space goes. So Iran first, and then Syria.
Yeah, there's always been the Iran party, and this manifested through people like John Kerry. Is always very willing to forgive Iran. Obama and Biden were always trying to appease Iran, give Iran nukes. Look, you got to understand, there's a very strong anti-Israel feeling in the Democratic Party and in some elements of the American right. You know, the what do they call them? The British Israelite element, the people around Ron Paul and folks like that, the anti-Semitic element. So Iran is always forgiven. It's always given the benefit of the doubt. Look, I believe Iran has several nukes now. They may not be armed, but that's just a matter of putting the top on, you know, and letting them go. And anyway, what is to stop Russia shipping a couple of nukes across the border tomorrow? What, on a truck? What's to stop them? You know, we act as though North Korea and Iran are rogue players. You know, we'll use China to settle North Korea down. We'll use Russia to moderate Iran. It's absolute garbage. Iran is a puppet of Russia. North Korea is a puppet of Russia and China. You know, Rocket Boy has 12 Russian bodyguards around them. They only do what the Russians and the Chinese let them do. So I think very much so that Iran would be willing to use nukes against Israel, and probably already has enough there that they could arm some pretty darn quickly if the opportunity, if they were given the order, if Moscow gave them the order. So I think that's a huge danger. Turkey's an interesting case. Turkey is now really the world leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the jihadi element that used to be coming out of Saudi Arabia is now really coming out of Turkey. You know, that's why Ilhan Omar goes to Turkey and meets with Turkish diplomats, because, you know, she is, well, but she also pro-Iran as well. We've got to get rid of this distinction between Sunni and Sunni and Shia, as if it's real at the top levels. So, but the Shia have this, you know, the 12th Imam stuff. They really believe in hastening Armageddon. So they're a very dangerous force because they're basically run by the Russians. But a lot of their people have swallowed this ideology that their job is to create Armageddon because this is their role in history. So you couldn't get a more dangerous combination than that. So I was very, very aggravated with Witkoff when he basically pushed Israel to stop attacking Hamas. Thankfully, it's now resumed. But Israel needs to be allowed to deal with Iran too. That has to be the case, because Iran is a proxy of Russia, and when it suits, Iran will use its nuclear weapons, because a lot of their people believe that's their historical duty to wipe Israel off the map. They talk about it enough. It's written in their constitution, I believe. But Turkey, I think Turkey will go. It suits them to be with NATO. It suits them to help Ukraine at certain times. But Turkey will do what Turkey wants to do. And I do not view them as a reliable long-term ally, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. What do we do? Well, before we go, so last week, Tucker goes and does 2 interviews. He interviews the prime minister / foreign minister of Qatar.
Yeah.
And then turns around and interviews the president's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff. And I don't know, my initial impression was the Qatari guy was lying through his teeth through the entire interview.
Yeah.
And Witkoff was, at best, extremely ignorant of the Qataris and the influence of the Qataris and Hamas. I mean, what was your impression of those interviews?
Yeah, Witkoff is clueless. Witkoff doesn't even know the provinces in Ukraine that are under Russian attack and occupation. He can't even name them. Look, the guy might be great in real estate deals in Manhattan, but it's like you might as well get Madonna to go and negotiate the nuclear, you know. It's just absolutely beyond, you know, he's a buddy of Trump's. You know, Trump values loyalty a lot. But look, Witkoff is a disaster in Ukraine. He knows nothing about Russia. He's completely naive. And he got completely snowed by the Qataris. The Qataris are Muslim Brotherhood to the hills. The Qataris are a massive force for terror in the world. But now we've got to be their friends for a while, do we? No. Witkoff should be one. I don't think Witkoff is one of these Duganist types. I think Witkoff is just clueless. Just absolutely clueless. And
well,
Tucker is basically just, there's no enemy of America that Tucker doesn't like. Can you name one that Tucker hasn't defended?
No, I mean, it's sort of like, this is just me, Trevor. I used to ask the question back during the Obama days. I had someone in D.C. relay a story to me that they had heard where, because my impression of Obama was I kept asking, like, when is he ever going to do anything foreign policy that's against Russia, that's not supporting Russia ultimately? Yeah. And somebody said, well, you know, I met somebody in D.C. and can't tell you who it was, but it was a Russian guy, and said, like, my comment to him was, we don't know where this Obama guy came from. He came like out of nowhere. And the Russian guy responded, oh, well, we've known about Obama since he was in college, which would make sense since he was raised by Frank Marshall Davis, a radical communist in Hawaii. Yeah. But and so I keep asking these questions: is when are we going to get things right? And I appreciate your comments. I really want to follow up again with you. I'm pleased to have made your acquaintance.
Well, this is the thing. This is what I started with. Why don't we get things right? Because we have traitors like Obama and Bill Clinton and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in high positions of power. And we're not well, and Mitch McConnell on the Republican side and others too. We are not willing to confront the infiltration of our system by our enemies because we're just too terrified of ever being called a McCarthyist. You know, you have to have a hammer and sickle tattooed on your forehead before somebody will dare to call you a communist. You know, I wrote about Kamala Harris's communist background. She's a red diaper baby, same as Obama. Obama was chosen out at a young age for great things. So was Clinton, came into it in college. You know, we have a long series of leaders of the Democratic Party who've been communists. There still are communists. Nancy Pelosi's as radical as AOC. She just has a bit more circumspection than AOC. And so that's like, why did America not win the Vietnam War? Why wasn't America not able to defeat a bunch of guys in pajamas? Any American veteran I've ever talked to said we could have won the war in 6 months. Why didn't we? Because our leaders wouldn't let us. Because our leaders were working for the Russians. The Russians spent more money on the American peace movement than they did supporting the Vietnamese that time. We had so many, Father Drinan, all these pro-Russia guys in Congress sabotaging us. Why weren't we allowed to win in Korea? Why The only war we were allowed to win was World War II because the Russians were under attack. So we had to win that one to save Russia, you know. But ever since, we've been sabotaged by leaders in high positions, secretaries of state like John Kerry and others who are basically, whether they're conscious enemy agents or not, they act as enemy agents. And that's Biden, that's Obama, that's Bill Clinton, and that was certainly Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, and it's people in the Republican Party as well. So that's our problem. You know, if you had a real patriot running Britain and not Keir Starmer, I'd be a lot more confident that Britain would stand up to Ukraine. But I know Keir Starmer's background, and I know he might say the right things, but I know he's basically a communist. So how can I trust him to defend the West? How do I have confidence in that man?
Well, Trevor, I was going to say, sorry,
Mark, why don't you make a few comments and then I'll finish this up here. Go ahead, Mark.
But Trevor, thank you. I fully agree with you. He is a total and utter communist. And what is deeply, deeply upsetting, fully aware, because of some of my own media experience, is the infiltration all over, the control. No one held Starmer to account. And I'll just end with this. When he was asked a question, when he said, and you know, people think we're conspiracy theorists, we're not, Westminster or Davos, and he said Davos every time, and people still voted for this individual. However, in the classic sort of Fabian attack mode, they had annoyed so many people because it's two wings of the same bird. The fact that people then decided not to vote at all. Trevor,
yeah, well, look, you know, Rishi Sunak, was opened the immigration floodgates. You know, you call him a conservative in bed with China. Yeah, the British people were faced with a horrible choice.
Yes, yeah.
Either a pro-Chinese wimp who opened the country to immigration, or basically a communist. And what did Keir Starmer win with 34% of the vote, or something, 31% or something? He got less than Jeremy Corbyn.
Jeremy Corbyn, absolutely right.
But because the Conservative vote rightly collapsed, he's now the Prime Minister. But this is it. We need courageous leaders, and they've got to be faithful leaders. And we got to be much more discerning on choosing our leaders. And so I understand. And this was the face with the choice we had in America. We had a communist, Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, pure communist, 100% communist, or a guy who loves America, who's done a lot of good things, but had a lot of pro-Russian people around him. That was our choice. Now our choice is, how the hell are we going to get rid of these Russian people around Trump and try and save his presidency while there's still some time.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt there. You said a really important thing earlier, which is about the spiritual. As someone has said greater than me, there is no political solution to a spiritual problem. And we do have, this is a spiritual problem. And on a personal note, I cannot thank you enough for being able to sit down and have this incredible conversation with you, where I will walk away with a heck of a lot of things to think about. And I'm very grateful to you for the tutoring. I'm not again blowing blue smoke over the Atlantic in your direction. I mean it genuinely, because I'm very grateful for the work that you've done.
Well, I appreciate that, and I welcome the opportunity to actually get asked really good questions, probing questions that give me an opportunity. And I hope everybody watching this will do their own research. Don't take what I've said as you know, I make my mistakes occasionally. You know, do your own research. Be discerning. We're told to be discerning. We're not supposed to be idiots. You know, we're supposed to be discerning, and too many people, you know, the American education system and the British education system has been so degraded for 100 years now. There's not enough discerning people out there left, unfortunately. And so, if we don't have these sound foundations in our history and the philosophy of our governments and what liberty means, we don't have those strong foundations. We can get sucked into these Duganist things, these Marxist things, these Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn type scams, we can be sucked in. But I think this is a spiritual battle. The devil is the prince of lies. The lies are everywhere right now. The answer is a spiritual foundation and better discernment and courage, because courage is proof of faith. Courage is proof of faith. When have we ever won anything great for our societies without courage? You know, Magna Carta, the Great Revolution of 1688, the American Revolution, winning World War II. When did we ever do anything great or permanent without courage? Because courage proves faith, and faith pleases God.
It's a great way to end. Trevor, where can people follow you on social media and the internet?
Go to trevorloudon.com. All my books are available there. I've got a new one out on the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who is also a communist. Yeah, Anthony. So go to my website, trevorloudon.com. I also have a website called keywiki.org, KEYWIKI, which has got 175,000 files of American, British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, communist, socialist, Marxist, radicals, right up from Prime Minister down to, you know, street level. So check out our files on Keir Starmer, check out our KeyWiki file on some of these British communists, American communists, Kamala Harris, Tim Walz. You know, the information's out there.
Thank you. Well, Trevor, we're both grateful, humbled, and honored that you would take the time to talk to us today. We look forward to doing it in the future.
Oh, happy to, guys. Happy to. Like, I'm honored. You know, this is great for me.
Yeah, I'm gonna end the recording. I would like you to just hang on for just a minute, though, and we'll say goodbye on the other side. So, sure. Mark and Trevor, thank you, and everybody, please like, share, subscribe to any channel that you find this on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.